Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this session. Apologies for the slightly late start, but I think we're ready to get going. We have got one more panellist who is going to be joining us, so hopefully she'll be with us very shortly. My name is Emma Erskine-Fox. I am an associate in the Data Privacy and Cybersecurity team at TLT, which is a law firm headquartered in Bristol, but with a national presence across all the UK jurisdictions. So I work with clients across the spectrum, right from startups to large global organisations, helping them with all manner of data protection and privacy law issues. I'm really excited to be joined today by 4 panellists. We have got, as I say, one more on the way, but they're all brilliant. They're from a range of backgrounds, a range of specialisms, but with one common interest and expertise in data ethics. So I'll ask them all to introduce themselves in a moment. Data ethics is something that I personally am really interested in, really fascinated by. And in the work that we do in our team at TLT, we are increasingly finding ourselves advising on not only whether the law says that you can do something with data, but also whether morally and ethically it's something that you should do. And I think organisations are expected to be taking an ethical approach in a number of ways, more and more nowadays. You know, you see that in sort of environment and sustainability in terms of how organisations treat their people and also how they treat their data. So we're going to use this session today to explore some different perspectives on sort of what data ethics means, what it entails, and then look at kind of how this area might be more regulated over the next few years and what sorts of things tech companies can be doing and should be thinking about to make sure that they are building ethical approaches into their data handling practices. So if I could ask each of the panellists to briefly introduce themselves and their specialisms and their interest in data ethics, that would be brilliant. So we'll maybe start with Matt, if that's okay.
No problem. My name's Cathie ONeill. I am a final year PhD student, hoping that final year will be over soon enough, from the Senator George Day Medical Institute for Security, Peace and Justice. It's an abnormally long name at Queen's University Belfast. My area of speciality is the European Union's digital single market, and my specialism in that is looking at artificial intelligence policy across member states, understanding the north-south, east-west vertical divides between the member states and how they could achieve a better union in terms of digital growth for member states.
Great. Matt, you're a little bit quiet, so you might just have to speak slightly closer to your to your laptop, if that's okay. I think we caught all of that, but just for the rest of the session. So, Catherine, onto you, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Great to be here bright and early on a Friday. As you may know, I'm the director of Limina Immersive. Until the pandemic hit, we ran VR events, and we had our own VR theatre even last year for 6 months as a pop-up on the harbour side, with the goal of bringing virtual reality to broader audiences. So we would screen cultural, creative, immersive media, mainly VR and headsets, in a synchronized way to groups of audience members. They'd buy a ticket for it, a bit like going to the cinema or going to the theatre. And it gave ultimately it gave a way that was sort of normal for audiences to experience virtual reality, emerging technology. And my angle on data ethics is very much from the audience's perspective, because we partnered, ever since we started really in 2016, we partnered with universities and research organisations to understand our audiences. And that meant that those studies that were done gave us a really great insight into what audiences are excited about with this new medium, but also what they're concerned about. And data came up again and again and again. So really juicy and important topic, especially when we're talking about the future of, well, not just immersive media, but emerging technology generally in innovation. So that's the angle I come at it, is usually audience perspective, looking at their hopes and their fears and their dreams around it. Thanks, Emma.
Great. Perfect, thanks. Gareth, if you could introduce yourself and then maybe ask Nolene too as well.
Sure, thanks Emma, and morning everyone. I'll look at the camera. So my name's Garrett Ogden. I work at TLT with Emma, partner and head up the data privacy and cybersecurity team. So advise on the full range of issues across GDPR, Data Protection Act, and as Emma's already alluded to, we're spending an awful lot of our time these days advising on matters of data ethics. Not just can I do something lawfully, but should I do it ethically? And we'll perhaps unpack some of those issues as we go through this session.
Thank you. And then last but definitely not least, Nolene, if you could just say a few words about yourself.
Good morning, everybody. And firstly, sorry, I joined a few minutes late, but I was having tech issues. I'm nerdymatamira. I'm one of the partners in TLT's Financial Services and Regulatory Practice. And I'm interested in the session and the interaction between data and ethics and its impact on innovation, because I've been in regulation pretty much my entire working life. And certainly when we started in regulation, the focus was very much on rules, what you can and cannot do. But as time has moved on, and particularly in recent times, we've seen a blurring of that distinction and more of a focus on what we would describe as softer issues. Is it fair? Is it right? Is it transparent? Is it just? And that's why this is of particular interest to me, because particularly in the regulated space, we're moving away from the certainty of this is what the rules prescribe, this is what the law says, and now we're moving into regulation and trying to guide and advise in a context where the rules are not so black and white.
Brilliant. Great. Thanks so much, everybody. So we'll get started. I think one of the first things I'd like to touch on and get perspectives from all of the panelists on is, from your point of view, when you talk about data ethics, what does that mean, and why is that something that is important for organisations to be thinking about? Or maybe start again with Matt, actually, if that's okay. Just Matt, I'm sure you've got a lovely academic definition for us of data ethics.
Can you hear me okay? Just to be clear.
Yes, I can hear you all right now. Just make sure you're speaking up.
A lovely academic. I don't think we have a lovely academic definition of data ethics at this moment. I feel it's a very, still a very heavily debated idea of what does it mean. On one level you have, I always would go back to people, and look at it through their lens when it comes to workers' rights, when we talk about that a bit later on, to protecting people's rights in terms of how their data is being used, what ways their data is being used, and their right to know how it's being used. On another level, is data ethics a prescriptive elements that we just need to be able to follow this to make sure in terms, or so much about I can't remember the name of the author, but he talked a bit about Native Americans when they believed a photo was being taken of them, a part of themselves was gone. He brought that into it in this day and age when we're giving out so much of our data and it's being used for so many different things. Are we giving a part of ourselves? And he always says we start thinking about that, because then we might be more oh, sorry, the sound is still very quiet. Kieran, I apologize. I'm moving closer to the lap. That's all I've got going for me here. But he talked about how if we view it that way, people might care more about data ethics and be more involved and engaged in the conversation, because I think some people are a bit turned off at times. I know my own family and friends are, and I start talking about it. So there isn't a clear one-all catch-all fit-all in terms of a philosophical sense for data ethics, but in a political idea which my background and what nations would do. And they have an idea, but again, I think in a conversation we've had, legislation sort of spins out too quickly. So I wish I could give a nice, clear, neat answer, but the debate in that is still very highly contested in what it is.
Yeah, and is that something kind of from a legal perspective, Gareth and Nolene? Again, I'm not sure it's something we've got a nice sort of legal definition of what we mean by data ethics.
Shall I go first, Gareth? Yeah, and say from a legal perspective, I don't believe we've got a definition, certainly from my practice area, but we've certainly got things that allude to concepts of ethics and fairness, as I was saying earlier, and certainly within regulation, it's going back to conferring an unfair advantage, for example, because you hold information. Does that mean that you now have the upper hand? And usually in that context, in my space, it's very much the big bank, the big financial institution being able to confer a benefit, whether it's financial or otherwise, as a result of the information that they hold. And that's sort of where we tend to think of ethics and potentially data and this manipulation in regulation.
Yeah, I think Emma, certainly from my perspective, it's one of those things that's difficult to define, but you know it when you see it. And so any kind of almost abusive position, or just a feeling that one of those where your gut feeling is often right. You know, people using AI tooling and other tech products to monitor their employees. You know, there might be very good reasons for doing it, but it's not going to be applicable in all scenarios. And there are levels that you can go to monitor your employees whilst they're at work. Do you necessarily need to be very invasive in looking at every screen that they view, counting their keystrokes, checking when they're at the desk and when they're not at the desk? You know, what's the purpose for you doing that? And if you don't really have a good answer to it, it probably means you shouldn't be doing it. Is broadly speaking, you know, it's those kind of scenarios that I think help to give some context to where you fall on the right or the wrong side of that data ethics line.
That's really interesting. Oh, sorry, Catherine.
Go on, Emma.
No, I was just going to pick up, Gareth, on what you were saying about you know, the sort of gut instinct often being right, because actually one of the things I find myself saying to clients a lot is, you know, think about how you would feel if this was your data, and you know that's what helps you sort of think about that kind of ethical approach. You know, if somebody was doing this with your data, how would you feel? And if that makes you sort of cringe and makes you go, oh no, I'm not convinced by that, then as you say, possibly that's kind of falling on that wrong side. Catherine, I'm so sorry I interrupted you. So.
Just using virtual reality as a case study here, and how audiences would feel about what data ethics is, and talking to our audience members and having heard various concerns, I think it's that moment before you put the headset on when things can flash up in your mind. Is this a brainwashing device? Is what this going to do to me? Who owns this space that I'm about to go into? And we've heard lots of those concerns. We actually, Limina, we don't record it, like we don't record the data. We don't. There was no like eye tracking or anything like that. Every part of data that we're recording has been through. It's either like a specific survey or a university study where you know we've got a focus group afterwards. So actually, it's not as scary as audience members would think it to be, because we wouldn't have that kind of body data tracking. But hearing those concerns, I think often it's a case of ownership where the concerns around data ethics are. So who owns this space that I'm about to go into, and what's their goal? I had a very interesting experience actually when I was at the BBC, which was when my colleague Dan and I, we just finished producing Easter Rising Voice of a Rebel, which is like one of the first public-facing VR experiences that had been released by the BBC. And while we were making it, we were actually sitting next to Adam Curtis, who was making his, I think he was making Hypernormalization at the time, actually, the famous documentary maker. And because we had been, you know, sitting next to him, beavering away at our work for months, and he hadn't tried it. So we offered to say, oh, do you want to have a go? And he was really skeptical about putting the heads on, and in fact wouldn't, because it was owned by Facebook. And actually that little experience then, it rings true and it becomes more and more relevant, I think. And I keep thinking back to it. It was years ago, but the way now that Facebook insists that you have to be logged in order to go on an Oculus Quest or an Oculus Go, that also has an impact on data ethics. So I think that's something that I guess I'm not really defining what data ethics is, but I'm sort of talking about the audience concern around it. Now, a lot of the platforms, I think, will start to see this sort of not only a grab over who's got the hardware, but also who's got ownership of the data and whose profile is, and how does that connect to the audience member's profile.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Catherine. We had a point made in the just in the event chat that ownership kind of more really is about trust, you know, rather than necessarily specifically about ethics. But I think those two concepts are so inherently linked, because you know you need, in order to succeed and in order for people to use your products, use your solutions, you need some level of trust. And I think that ethical approach to that and thinking about ownership and almost the ownership of the individual over their own data, that's kind of, in my mind, how you work towards kind of building that trust. And so in terms of what we've kind of got at the moment to govern all of this, appreciating that there aren't necessarily specific laws about data ethics, it'd be interesting just briefly to explore kind of the framework at the moment that does regulate how this all works, how organizations have to treat data, the sort of approaches that they need to take. So, interested to hear, firstly, from the lawyers, I think, about, the legal side of that briefly, what the sort of rules and policies are that govern that, and then maybe Matt on the sort of policy side, and particularly interested in kind of how the UK's approach compares to approaches that you're seeing in other countries. So, yeah, maybe if we start with Gareth and Nolene on that legal side, just as a brief overview, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. And as you touched upon, Emma, it's the law's an imperfect tool in areas such as this where things are evolving so rapidly, and the GDPR still feels new to many people. It's been in force for 2.5 years, but it was actually first drafted nearly 10 years ago now, and so GDPR is the primary piece of legislation that deals with processing of personal data. But it doesn't really talk to ethics in any meaningful or substantive way. There's lots of good principles there that would apply to something like an AI or a VR deployment, but it's not really tailored for that. As the name suggests, it's general. It's the general data protection regulation. We have other bits of legislation that kind of augment what's there in GDPR, so the Data Protection Act in the UK. If you're thinking about it in a marketing context, then we've got the privacy and electronic communications regulations, and various other bits of legislation, codes of practice. The guidance, I guess, is particularly helpful when you're looking at matters of data ethics. So the Information Commissioner's Office publishes an awful lot of information, actually, which can be and is very helpful at times. And then, as Nolene will no doubt come to talk about, when you're moving into an area where an organisation is regulated by somebody in addition to the ICO, then there are other things to think about as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would agree with that, Gareth. And I guess looking at a very specific area, when you're looking at an entity that's a financial services institution, a bit like just the wider piece, there isn't any specific provision that deals with data ethics within the scope of financial services, for example. But what we do find are elements of it that play to the whole data and ethics piece. So, for example, in financial services, you talk about principles such as treating customers fairly. It's something that when I started off in regulation, the authorities very rarely ever took action on the basis of you have treated your customers unfairly. But we're seeing more and more firms being brought to book just on the back of you have had an unfair advantage, you have not treated your customers fairly. And more recently, this has now been coupled with concepts such as vulnerability, and just recognizing that if someone is vulnerable, there is a greater onus on regulated entities to be conscious of how decisions are made, how you assess that particular candidate for certain products or services. Are you being fair? Is this an ethical decision-making process? And it's almost adding an additional layer of considerations to say, if you're dealing with the average person in normal circumstances, the bar is here, and the bar is raised even further if you're dealing with somebody who is bereaved, somebody who has a health condition, which means their ability to engage is different. So again, that becomes an ethical consideration, which isn't set out in statute, but it's certainly something worth bearing in mind. And outside of that, there are also other wider concepts such as conduct of business considerations. Now, there are masses and masses of rules and guidance around how you conduct your business if you're a regulated firm. They speak very much to how certain things are done, information disclosures and so on, but the general ethos behind the conduct of business requirements is ethical considerations. How do you run your business? What are you about? What is your culture about? Which again, all speak to ethics, but we haven't got a prescriptive piece of legislation that we can point to say, and here it is. But it all comes together, and I think we end up in the same place.
And Matt, what about on that sort of policy side, looking at the kind of European level, particularly in the digital single market? What are the sorts of things in there that sort of tie in with all of this?
Well, I'm going to give an analogy I give to my students when I'm teaching, when I'm talking about policy and legislation being brought in the member states. I always say, if you get in a room, to give an example, the UK always went down to London and bought the fancy paid £100 where not bashing Poland, they went to B&Q, bought the £20 paint and painted the room that way. On paper, it was still the same process of the commission's work coming down, but the abilities and the strategies to deal with that in their own internal law was completely different. If I could just start off with AI and the 3 pillars, and I'll just go into some key examples just to have that come through. The first one is there's 3 pillars of the European AI strategy. The first is being ahead of technology development and encouraging uptake by the public and private sectors. The second is based on preparing for social economic change brought by AI. And the third is ensuring appropriate and legal framework, and they have developed a framework for that. I mean, these are very broad, generalized positions I felt they've naturally put into different contexts. And I feel it can be very vague and doesn't give much guidance. And I think that comes in when you do different comparisons by different member states. For instance, Austria, to my amazement, when I was researching this last year, at this point, still doesn't have a fully fledged AI strategy like other member states. Then others have taken a different approach, where if you look at Scandinavia and the Baltic states, very small territories, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, the And Islands, and the Baltic countries, Latvia and Lithuania, decided to actually work together. So they've pulled together their countries' joint researchers and created a declaration on AI policy and ethics and how they can work together. Also to ease and better transfer of information and data around this. Going back to Jeff's point when he was talking about, trust, and when you said they're so interlinked, that declaration was more about building the pathway of trust to have that bridge to share that. Interestingly, going down, so I have a list of all this, France has made artificial intelligence a public approach. And so maybe I'm talking too much. I'll wrap up in a moment, Emma, don't worry. France has made it a public approach, and they've invested a lot of time in healthcare and data for healthcare, and it's really come to fruition during the pandemic. And interesting, in Germany, I talk about the Niederlande and how Germany has specialized in car manufacturing. We all know that they're big car, but they're looking at automated cars to compete with Silicon Valley. But AI has ruckused in the German model because of the regional governments. There is no unified approach, even though on the outside it seems. So I guess also Greece is a fascinating one, sorry, for our audience. There's really mixed emotions in Greece about AI. And I'm gonna pitch that because they naturally teach philosophy in secondary school. So they think about these things in a more way, which will be one of my big pitches. Any industry is hesitant to take this on. There seems to be a real growing disenfranchisement with that. And another example would be Hungary, and Hungary has no AI policy at all still. So my whole point in trying to just give these different examples is that very much across Europe, there's different standards and different levels for people out. There's been no one fit size all the European Union would actually like to get in. And I think AI policy and data ethics is very much tied to robust economies. And if they're not robust economies, they're going to take their time to work on that. There's also an issue where big member states are leading the way in this, where smaller member states would be generally more innovative in their approaches, but there is an in-power balance there. That is meant to be addressed through the every 3-month presidential. But my argument would be to try and appease bigger states in different forms of regulation. That is not the price taken. But inside the internal frameworks, just for the example of Germany, there very much is that not disenfranchisement, but it isn't a clear path as they would like to make it seem out to be. That's sort of the state of play and how it's operating in the EU. So in terms of the UK, they are quite advanced. They'll be up there with Germany and France. But again, I would make the case that we've sort of dropped the ball of Brexit. I don't want to. I'm sorry, I have to say the B word. If you're doing EU studies, you have to say the B word. But we have dropped the ball of Brexit, and there is no clear strategy afterwards. Do we align with the European Union to do the smaller example of the Baltic states, or do we not? And that's a question that's not been answered. It's not being asked, and sort of just left drifting out there in the AI space.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think I'd be really interested to explore that a little bit more a bit later, Matt, in terms of kind of those differences and what lessons we might be able to learn from that. So I'm sure we'll come back to that in a bit. In the meantime, though, be interested in views on kind of what the challenges are for businesses at the moment in terms of building data ethics into their processes. I think, Catherine, you'd be a really good starting point for this as an innovator, as somebody who's kind of at the kind of coalface of innovation. Be really interested to hear your views on that.
Well, I think that point earlier about the relationship between ethics and trust is a really good, really important one, because the two, as you say, they're so interlinked. Because if I don't feel that somebody's very ethical, I'm less likely to trust them, and therefore I'm less likely to do the thing that they're offering me. And it's the same with businesses as well. So looking to the VR theatre, say, if somebody was walking past the venue on the harbour side and felt, oh, that looks a bit shady. Oh, what are they doing? It looks kind of sci-fi. Are they brainwashing people? How ethical are they? We're obviously less likely to sell tickets, because the audience that we're going for is much broader than those early adopters. Our audience, median audience member is a woman over 30, which is completely against the grain of that early adopter virtual reality demographic. And that group is way more likely to be skeptical of new technology generally and of virtual reality. There was some data that Comres and the law firm Wiggin got in 2017. They did a study around people's concerns around virtual reality specifically, and they did find the same thing. Older people and women tend to be more concerned about it, about its ethics, about the data, and therefore, I guess the follow-on then is they're probably less likely to have trust, which probably explains why we see this the difference in who's early adopters and who's not. Anyhow, from our perspective as a business, what processes do we put in place to combat this? One was like the design of the space, being light and airy and fresh and full of plants, and then using familiarity. So I guess you could follow that through to other businesses with the design that feels very much of the present and has elements of familiarity. Then also being really clear in our language on our website and when we're selling tickets. This is what to expect. This is who we are. Talking a lot about who we are. A lot of our social media presence was around the people who ran the business. So me and the team, that helps a lot. And then also working with, again, coming back to that connection between ethics and trust. Working with brands that already there's a trust in, because that skepticism or that concern that would stop people from buying tickets, that would stop us growing as a business. It really, really matters to the extent where there has to be something we learned. There has to be something familiar about the sort of the product equation to allow for that trust to grow. So we're actually at the moment we're working with the NHS on a project that's launching next week called Lost in Song. And I think of all the brands to be working with right now, and NHS is a very, very trusted brand. And when people see that logo, they know, I mean, this is going to be something that people can put themselves into. They can, and once you've got that sense of security as an audience member, not only is that helping. I mean, our NHS project is not for profit, but generally it helps our bottom line, helps us be sustained as a business. But it also allows the audience to have a better experience, because when you feel that the business is ethical, and especially in data, and you've got that trust, then also it allows you to sort of throw yourself in and surrender more to the experience, which with virtual reality makes a big difference. If you surrender to that, then going into VR, then it's more powerful, essentially. So it's I keep coming back to that point about the relationship between trust and ethics. It's a really good one.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting what you're saying, Catherine, about the kind of the familiarity, building that familiarity and the sort of trying to reach people who are maybe not early adopters, who might be a different demographic from that. And one of the things that I think is interesting is to think about, whether are those people, is that fear kind of coming from the sort of the lack of regulation, or the kind of the fragmented regulation in this area? Is it an area where people are scared of the technology because they don't think that it's something that is properly governed, and that they think that businesses can just go and do what they want?
I think there is a bit of a wild west right now, which, to be honest, there are some parts that really are, and there's a complete lack of regulation specifically around virtual reality, which I think that needs to be addressed. Even though there's been parliamentary inquiries, it's not it's not led to anything specific, any laws unique to this sector. If we had that, yeah, that would help in terms of building consumer trust to know that this is a specifically regulated sector. So yeah, that helps. If you have that safeguard there, then it helps build consumer trust and it can help an industry grow.
Does that, Nolene and Gareth, from your perspectives as lawyers in that, does that kind of align with your thinking in this space? Is it something where they think that the sort of more governance around it can help to build that trust? You're still on mute, Nolene.
Sorry, thank you. More governance is useful. Within regulation, we like a lot of governance. The more governance, the more framework we have, the more comfortable we are. But data ethics, I think, is slightly different. Absolutely do have a governance framework, but I tend to feel that the challenge to firms really properly engaging with data and ethics is it's not something that readily has a pounds and pence value within financial services, the space I operate in, because you tend to find if a firm or a business is motivated by selling a particular service, be it insurance, be it a bank account, whatever service it is, that's where they look to make their money. But the notion of actually spending resource, eating into the bottom line to service concepts that don't necessarily automatically translate into more policyholders, more bank accounts, you do struggle in that space. And really is trying to get to a place where you can either equate a monetary value to say the more ethical you are, the more you are likely to increase your bottom line. And we're seeing a bit of an increase in that space where you're looking at more of the green initiatives, for example, where people are saying, you know, I wish to invest ethically. I wish to invest in a business which has the right values that are consistent with the way that I see the world. There is growth in that space, but would I say they're leading the march? We're not quite there. The bottom line, I think, is a challenge and an impediment, because the notion of spending money to look after, going back to my earlier remarks, vulnerable customer who makes 2% of our overall customer base doesn't sound like a financially sensible approach. So I think you will always be up against a bit of a tension there. And I think the trust piece plays a part, but it's not a primary driver. Again, we're back to a bank is a bank is a bank. If I approach my bank, I'm expecting to be able to withdraw funds. Do I ponder when I'm stood outside an ATM, do I trust this bank? Not really. My issue there is when I turn up at the ATM, if I have money in my current account, I expect it to come out of the wall. So I think it's a slightly different dynamic, but it's interesting hearing Catherine's views where the driver is more around the trust piece as opposed to I'm here to get a service. Am I getting the service that I'm paying for?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Gareth.
I think, Emma, just to add to that, certainly, and no doubt you would say the same from what you see in practice, but it's certainly true to say that different sectors take a different approach and probably have different engagement with their users, the data subjects that they engage with. So, for example, in financial services, likewise in the public sector, where there is a high level of expectation generally from the public, you know, I don't have a choice whether or not to give my my bank details and national insurance details to the government because I need to pay my tax bills. I need to pay to cross the Dartford crossing or whatever it is. You know, you have to do it, and so I think there is a higher degree of expectation that you need to make sure that you know what you're doing, and likewise in financial services, I think people just have a higher degree of expectation. Whereas you move to somewhere like retail or leisure, you know, we've seen, and you really feel for these businesses, actually, you know, thousands of businesses this year, particularly in the leisure sector, who traditionally wouldn't have had to think about keeping records of people's data when they come into their restaurant or their pub, and logging that information and doing something with it. And obviously, since the onset of COVID, restaurants and pubs have had to do that kind of thing and had to very quickly become quite sophisticated data controllers holding vast sets of data that they never had to do previously. Now, the data that's being processed there is pretty low grade, you know, it's name, email address and phone number, but nonetheless, there's a value to that data set. and we as consumers, have to feel comfortable giving them that data. I think there is a tension, isn't there, between regulation providing clarity, but potentially stifling innovation, and what how do we as a country want to position ourselves in that regard? I think what's likely to happen is where you find, just had the fines confirmed for British Airways and the Marriott for their data breaches a couple of years ago, 20 million and an 18 million pound fine or thereabouts. And if I'm a consumer, if I frequent the Marriott hotel, do I feel great about the fact that they didn't undertake proper due diligence before they acquired a company? No, I don't actually. And does that impinge? Does that impact on my views as to whether or not I'm willing to do something more innovative with them? Well, maybe not the first time, but if it happens time and time again, it starts to chip away at that consumer confidence. And you see that in things like the share price taking a dip whenever there is a major data breach for one of those major multinationals. So there's an awful lot wrapped up in that, but no doubt we'll pick through some more points.
Yeah, and I think there's some really interesting points that are linked to this that's been made in the chat actually, around the sort of the trust in brands, and this sort of idea that you could have trust in a brand doing what that brand is meant to do, but you might still not have trust in the way that they use their data, and there might be a sort of a bit of a dichotomy there. And the fact that there's a 3% trust score in Facebook, apparently, which is probably unsurprising. Although I think the interesting thing about that is that there's a 3% trust score in Facebook, but everybody still uses it. So I'm not sure. Again, there's a bit of a dichotomy maybe between sort of how people say they feel about what's being done with their data, and actually the things that they will be comfortable using. And kind of on that point, I suppose, this sort of privacy and data ethics point, Gareth, is it something that we kind of see getting kind of left behind a bit by some businesses? Is it often a bit of a kind of afterthought, and what's the sort of impact of that? You mentioned the fines that we've seen, which I think demonstrate the risks of what happens if you don't think about these kinds of things.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some truth in that, Emma, and absolutely we see different approaches in different sectors, but it also at a subsectoral level, it comes down to each organisation and just how important do they view consumer confidence, but also their accountability obligations under the GDPR, and their desire to do the right thing, in inverted commas, to act ethically. And different organisations will take a different view. What we have found certainly is that those organisations which, particularly in the digital space, and particularly in those kind of startups and fast growth businesses, those organisations which build a really clear data ethics and privacy by design principle into their business model and everything that they do, absolutely make a virtue of that, and it becomes part of their success. So Emma, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We work with a number of clients who are developing new products or services, particularly in complex data processing areas. And whilst they know that it's not their problem to solve, to understand what the lawful basis is for the processing, or what risks are there and how can they mitigate those risks, because typically they're acting as a data processor rather than a controller. Nonetheless, those organizations which say, look, I know this is going to be a real issue for my customer, for my client, and so I want to make the buying process as easy as possible for them, but also demonstrate that they can trust me with their data. And so we've worked with a number of organizations to undertake kind of call them what you want, but data protection impact assessment or something similar to that that another part of that sales cycle for them when they're pitching to clients, and they can say, look, this is what our product does and it's amazing and it's going to save you 30% on your efficiency or 20% on your bottom line or whatever it might be that they're selling, and that's all great. That's the real data, that the numbers that are important to you. But actually, we know what else you're going to be thinking about, and you will need to feel comfortable and confident that you can trust us to do this. And here's a document that shows you how you can do that.
That's really interesting. We've had a question that links to this, I think, which is, is this not all to do with kind of balancing that sort of business imperative to make a profit with the understanding that, collecting people's data at that kind of large scale and using that data can risk societal constructs and undermine moral norms, which I think is kind of exactly the point I think you're making, Gareth, is that, that there is always going to be a balance there, but actually it's something that if it's looked at in the right way can drive that that business imperative to make that profit.
Yeah, exactly right. You can make you can either ignore it or you can make a virtue of it. And in my experience, those businesses that make a virtue of it and build sound data ethics principles into their business model and their design methodologies tend to do very well.
I guess maybe.
Oh, sorry, Nadine, carry on.
Sorry, I was just going to chip into what Gareth has said to say, in an instance where they do make a virtue of it, I sense there was also the danger of you almost setting yourself up to have a very, very big fall if you do make quite a virtue of it and say this is my set piece, this is my talking piece, because you see that very much in the press. There's certain brands, certain service providers that when things go wrong, we kind of go, oh, well, that's to be expected, that's typical of X or typical of Y. But when it's somebody else, we go, oh my goodness, did you just see the fine in the papers? X and Y got that wrong. So again, it speaks to that dichotomy that you were mentioning, Emma.
Yeah. Catherine, again, just from the kind of innovator's perspective, I suppose, I think it's quite clear that ethics is something that's kind of at the forefront of your mind with your business endeavours. Do you think it's something that people are thinking about? Because I think that sometimes certainly in my experience, often businesses actually at the smaller end of the scale are much further ahead in their thinking on these sorts of things than some of the larger businesses, where there might be more sort of bureaucratic processes to go through, more hoops to jump through, etc. So is it something that you think from your experience would you agree with that, or is it something that you think is still maybe not thought about as much as it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I've certainly seen the culture change across just looking at startup culture in general for smaller organisations. Back in sort of when I first got involved in the kind of, I'd say it's a UK tech scene, I was very involved with sort of London tech startup world, something called Silicon Roundabout in East London, and was go to lots of these kinds of events and parties. And there was this sense, it felt a bit, it was a bit wild. There wasn't that much sense really of thinking about what's the ethical impact on our customers, what's the ethical impact on society, on the sector growth. It was more about disruption, because disruption's cool, and yeah, ethics felt, to be honest, like a bit of a side thing. But I feel like the culture's changed in that time. There's been sort of various, I think, large like macro waves of campaign that then have helped companies look further into their own practices. So even things, for instance, like Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, looking at even when GDPR came in from a regulatory perspective, those moments I think have changed, not fully changed, but have certainly had an impact on startup culture, where it is cool to be ethical. And it's not seen as a sort of strange byproduct, like why would you be interested in it? And I think we've seen that if you think about the technology adoption curve, which many of you may be familiar with, we've got the innovators and you've got the early adopters, then the technology goes to the early majority, the late majority. The further up that curve you go, the larger proportion of a population you reach. But if you want to reach those people, the late majority, even what gets called the laggards after that, those groups of people, as I mentioned earlier, as customers tend to be more concerned generally about the product, come back to trust in those businesses. So if you've got a startup and you want to appeal to those further down the adoption curve, then it's important right from the beginning that, yes, ethics is woven into your processes. And there's various techniques, that have been incorporated into process design in order to get there. So for instance, it's now quite standard to have focus groups very early on, rather than doing, say, it used to be quite normal to do kind of A/B testing, where you wouldn't actually, you'd launch a product that didn't actually exist, and get people to sign up to it. It's all advocated in the Lean Startup book, but people would sign up to something that didn't actually exist, and you'd see how popular it was when those potential customers didn't know that it was actually an experiment and that product didn't exist. Now that kind of practice isn't so common. You would have more like a focus group early on, maybe a customer panel, and you'd more co-create with your audience, with your customers. And actually, I think Bristol is great, for example, of ethical innovation, ethical design. We're in startup culture and corporate culture as well. There's some great, I think, techniques that I've seen, for instance, where Limina was, where we started in the Pervasive Media Studio, with Pervasive Media Studio residents. You see loads of great techniques being used by creative technology companies to understand ethical implications and ethical concerns of users. So yeah, I think Bristol is a great place to be in that regard.
I think Bristol's a great place to be generally, but I'm biased. So that kind of balance you mentioned, Catherine, I think is really interesting between kind of innovation and regulation. And one of the things that I would really like to explore is that in a bit more detail, because I think one of the challenges, certainly from my perspective, is that, you know, how do we regulate this area in a way that is going to help build trust, but whilst not stifling innovation. Gareth, again, you mentioned that earlier. I think there can be a risk. I think GDPR is already seen, certainly I see people thinking about it already as a sort of inhibitor rather than a facilitator of innovation. So I think it's really important that we strike that right balance in the UK, particularly kind of post-Brexit. You know, I think it's important that we, sorry, I bring up the B word again, but I think it's really important that we strike that balance and we have a framework that works for innovation. And so, I mean, Matt, I'd be really interested in your views on this in terms of, from your experience of kind of looking at what other countries have in place around this and the approaches that other countries take that you've mentioned before. What are the sort of lessons that we can learn from that in terms of the merits of different approaches to regulation in this area? I think you're on mute. I think you're still muted, Matt.
Sorry. Could I just go back 1 second? It's kind of tied to Jeff's point made in this comment. He talked about the UK government making it clear it wants to make AI a leader, and the US having a break then fix it approach. You are correct in that assertion, Jeff, but because of the speed and the unregulated field of China, the EU has been making a plan to create a form of norms around this about reverse engineering, as well as America. But EU is really pushing this forward because they see a gap in this and a real threat to their own internal markets. And, you know, it's known as the Brussels effect. And because they've actually, if I get a bit geopolitical, China bought off a few Czech MEPs to vote down these types of amendments in the actual EU Parliament. So they're actually working on these norms. Now, whether they become or not, it's something that America is going to have to face and China is going to have to face, and that will take place, whatever these new norms mean. So when you're talking about your point about, you know, the fix and broke, I don't think that's going to be a flexible problem for the US to work with, and well, definitely in terms of the EU. And I feel America might give up a small inch to the EU in that terms if they both want to work together to try and have China stop stealing a lot of their patents and reverse engineering them all. And I think that's a huge problem on the table on this, and a big question about ethics. But we won't go there for that point. But just to go back to that, the second one thing I have found really interesting with smaller member states, just when you were talking about all this and about data, is if we start thinking about treating our data like we treat our healthcare. And, you know, we all have regional trusts that take care of the healthcare, run the hospitals, and we all try and take care of ourselves. We make sure we go for our regular checkups. We know what's happening. I would be a big opponent from my research in the different areas of regional data centers throughout the UK, Northern Ireland, Scotland, around that, tied to like healthcare, and talk about it more like that, use that language. Because I think if we talked about, you know, as a part of ourselves and talk about that sort of paternal term, people will be more invested in it, because we all understand the NHS. Jeff made a very good point about the NHS and trust. We all trust, you know, well 57% trust in the NHS, and if we go about that and then now the issue there though is do we trust the government to act in our best interest to regulate that? Or then do we go down a deliberative democracy approach, and that we elect regional members of a panel? Was another thing that's happened in Estonia, where different citizens will be picked at random, like almost like a citizens' assembly, but on a smaller scale, and they will act on the best interest of that board. Would we trust our fellow citizens to do that and act upon that, because they will know on the ground the ethical issues this will make us face? So that's sort of where I'm at of the research, because my final pitch is trying to come up with these ideas, and that's sort of the idea I've been coming up to pitch to governments about that. And the UK does have space to be a real leader in this. I don't disagree with Jeff. I'm just concerned I don't believe real political will is there, or real understanding. Another thing I would advocate for is I would send all ministers on a short course to understand these different topics, because I often find when I listen, Nolene's laughing, she's like, I'm with Matt on this one, please send them, because not the berate ministers, they have they have a lot of brief and everything, and I understand that from my time there. It's just, I think they don't know the refined points that they need to know to engage a business, and I think they're failing business on a big scale in that sense. Sorry, that was a sort of rigmarole, but they're all interconnected, because I believe there's going to be norms set for this, and the UK needs to be at the front in helping setting these norms and working those international relations. But I also think there's a regional piece that they could be doing on a big scale, and we could connect it to the other areas we've seen in terms of, like I've said, linking it to health, and about how if we take care of our data like we take care of ourselves, I think that people be more receptive to that.
Nolene, are you with Matt on that? You look like you were looking to chip in on that. I really am.
No, I am with Matt on that, and I think there's always the challenge of allowing innovation to flourish without it being bogged down by regulation, by process, by policy, by government action. And often you tend to find the nature of policy or even lawmaking is incredibly slow. We tend to go out by way of a consultation, and then we will mull over our consultation paper. We'll spend 6 months, 9 months. Sometimes we even let it run for a year before we get, a view on this is what has come out of the consultation. And then it takes a further 6-9 months before we get a finalized position on this is what's going to happen by way of a change. And when you're thinking about it in the context of innovation, innovation is about being nimble. It's about being able to react and be able to make the most of opportunities. And there is almost being weighed down, bogged down by policy, by lawmaking. So there is something to be said for allowing, especially the UK as it becomes a third country, an opportunity to make the most of its opportunities and really stride ahead and not be as bogged down. And it might be a case of we engage with ministers, and whilst they're having their tutorial with Matt, on a lesser basis, and not have government at the heart and at the center of everything. So, innovation can really come into its own.
Yeah, I completely agree. We've had a question in, which I think is made for Gareth. So I'm going to throw it Gareth's way. It's a really interesting question. So, on the subject of innovation, given how much AI is exploding, should there be specific regulation governing the data used to train models and frameworks around fairness or making assumptions about how models are constructed? So things like credit risk models or facial recognition algorithms. Facial recognition, I think, is probably one of Gareth's favorite topics. But they are absolutely examples of how things can go a bit wrong. So Gareth, really interested in your thoughts on that.
I love a good bit of facial recognition technology, or at least discussion about it. I'm not necessarily so keen on them using it on my face, but there we are. And I think it's a really well-made point in the chat by Alex, and there is so much to think about in that context. So, picking up on facial recognition in particular, many people will be familiar with the fact that last year, the ICO issued its first statutory opinion on a matter, and they chose to pick live facial recognition technology and its use by law enforcement agencies, so the police, to check faces as they're coming into an area. So it's been used in things like the way into a football match or something like that, and the police will monitor the faces that are coming through, check that against a watch list that they have to be looking out for particular suspects that they might be seeking to identify and arrest. And so very clear policing benefit to using the technology. You can identify people and send them to jail if they're baddies, but very difficult issues from a privacy perspective and from an ethical perspective of, if I'm an average citizen, have done nothing wrong, going about my day-to-day business, should it be okay for the government, or in this case policing, to shove a camera in my face as I'm going to the football match, as I do every Saturday, or at the end of Waterloo Bridge as I'm on my commute, just because they might pick up some guy who may or may not look like me. So all sorts of ethical questions there. But to Alex's point in particular, there have been real issues with, not just in that law enforcement context, but more broadly where facial recognition is used, in terms of bias that can creep in, and fairness, where, for example, a lot of that technology, there have been independent studies on it that have demonstrated that it picks up a disproportionately high error match on so females and also individuals from BAME backgrounds, frankly, because it's largely not tested on black and minority ethnic faces. It's tested on white faces, and so it's better at reading white faces, and therefore it's picking up more people from those communities, and they're therefore being impacted by it much more frequently than is the case for those other individuals. And so there really is an issue there that needs to be addressed. We saw it again in the although this point never really played out in the summer because the government kind of backed down before we got to this stage. But with the exams fiasco, it's hard not to describe it as a fiasco from the summer, where people were just given predicted grades. And it was very much linked to postcode. It was a real postcode lottery. So if you happen to live in a particular area, then you might have your grades inflated. If you happen to live somewhere else, then it's going to be deflated. And there's all sorts of equality impacts there, because, you know, just because I live in a council estate, does it mean that I'm less intelligent? No, of course it doesn't. But because that postcode generally has delivered fewer people who receive higher grades, are going to be downgraded as a result. And when you factor in that not just the social mobility angle there, but the fact that it's likely to be the case that in many areas, people from BAME backgrounds are going to be living in postcodes which are likely to not meet the standard for a higher grade. It just fraught with difficulty, and frankly, quite whether it's not to be a good idea in the first place, I do not know. And it's from my personal perspective, the best thing possible that came out of it was to say we need to abandon this, because there would have been all sorts of equality impact and privacy litigation around that had that decision not been taken, is my view. You can see you've got me on my hobby horse, Emma. I could talk about facial recognition and guidance around this area all day. I'll conclude perhaps by saying the ICO, when they gave their statutory opinion over a year ago now, it was on Halloween last year, concluded by saying we need a statutory code of practice that deals with fairness and use of facial recognition technology. There's been very little chat about that in the 15 months that have followed, but I'm sure it will come up again post-Brexit.
I think just a point you make, Gareth, about the positives that came out of that fiasco in the summer with the A-level results, is that there is a generation now of young people who understand the very personal impact that algorithmic inequality can have, or algorithmically generated inequality can have. And so I guess they have been sort of activated, you know, they're aware. And I really hope that, I mean, it must have been a horrible thing to go through, but if throughout their lives they have that memory, and many, you know, hundreds of thousands of young people will be having this, they'll grow up and they'll become leaders of tomorrow. Hopefully that will allow that personal memory will stick, and it will allow them to make better decisions, and to be campaigning as well, maybe as they grow up. I thought that was one silver lining to come out of it, but it was so shocking. It also, I mean, that's when it starts to feel, algorithms can feel really, and even data ethics as a term, to the public can feel quite sort of abstract. But actually, that got very, very personal. And when I started even thinking about myself, like I was an example of a student, like sort of well-performing student, but in a very a school so bad it's been demolished. And so I would have been one of those students whose marks would have been downgraded. And I think lots of people it all became really, really personal. So I guess stories like that, some benefit. It starts to become personal when we become quite maybe in the future, we care about it more, and we'll be campaigning about it on the political agenda.
Just to add to that, Catherine.
Matt, you've gone a bit quiet again, Matt.
Just to add to that, Catherine, can you hear me now? Oh.
Yeah.
Thanks for attending the event that came up. In Northern Ireland, all the students formed a union and lobbied Stormont about this with the education minister and won. About protest. They have developed a high school union, secondary school union, about these sort of AI issues. And the protest has sort of already started here in how they're going about lobbying ministers of the Northern Ireland Executive.
And just on that, I guess the conversation has sort of very naturally flowed to the issue of engagement, because often with data, the biggest challenge is getting people to engage with their rights, to engage with their ability to say, I do not wish my data to be used this way and the other. And what we're tending to find now is the more it has a personal impact, the more you're likely to have appropriate engagement.
I think there's a bit of a problem with the it's chucking people out with the platform. I had to just come back in again.
Yes, I can see that.
Yes, it's just us two. Maybe as they come back, as something I thought I could talk about. You might have a view on it, Nolene, is the way that recently, I think coming back to Alex's question on the chat about innovation in regards to AI, this is something from sort of my world of immersive entertainment, but there's been this issue with people recreating those who've passed away into holograms. And then, for instance, Amy Winehouse, there was a plan at one point that she was going to go on tour, a posthumous tour. Oh, we've got Matt back again. Hi, Matt. And then there's also more recently Kanye West bringing back Robert Kardashian for his wife Kim Kardashian. Matt, it's good to see you're back, by the way. I don't know what's happening to the other people.
I don't know what happened. It sort of just took me away, and that was it. I was gone. I knew I had to come back to see you all. I apologize.
Yeah, we're just talking about the AI holograms that have been created or been proposed to be created of celebrities who've passed away. So, for instance, for Kim Kardashian's birthday, Kanye West had commissioned a hologram of Robert Kardashian, Kim's father. And did you hear about this? And he said he did this sort of monologue where he said how proud he was of Kim and how wonderful what it is that she's doing. Now she's going into law, but then also said, and you're married to the most genius man in the world. And I don't think he'd ever met Kanye. I mean, Kanye would have been too young probably before he passed away. So when that came up, I really thought there's got to be some sort of framework, ethical framework that we agree on as to what's okay for bringing back the dead. Is this something that Robert Kardashian really would have said? Would he be happy with that? And the same for Amy Winehouse as well, going on tour. She was already really pushed in her lifetime, and then to bring her back even after having had such a relentless tour schedule when she was alive, it's pretty I bet I've been interviewed a few times about this as somebody in virtual reality like, what do you think of this? Is this okay? And the answer is no, but we need some proper addressing from experts here and the public. We need to is this okay? Is this something that you would want when you passed away?
Yes.
Are you asking me that directly?
I'm asking everybody. In lieu of Emma.
Have we got Emma back, or have we lost Emma?
No, we've lost her.
No.
Hopefully she'll come back.
I suppose one thing sort of leads into the final question of the day is, what should businesses in tech be doing to ensure they keep data ethics as part of their solutions? I mean, I'm sure the company ever created the when you talk about that hologram, could they have done something or have that ethical question? Like, is there anything, like, what should be done? I know basically my pitch would be, I would recommend everybody to read no, that's not it, sorry. Gareth was trying to, that's all right. I'd recommend, I think this is a very great book for anybody to read, even if designer or not. I recommend, Meaningful Inefficiency, Civic Design in an Age of Digital Expediency is a really good book to read to try and think about that process that everybody could have. And the second thing I think to that question is, I would tell people to be really brave and hire a philosophy students or a sociology students after they leave to come in and actually work in the tech team and embed them in part of that process to challenge all these processes. You don't have to agree with them, but I think it's very good to have that sort of some knitting ear. I mean, hang on. Gareth, do you have anything you think people need to be doing? These are the experts. These are the real people. These give real legal hardcore advice. I just waffle on about policy.
No, I think just read the law. Read the law. No, I completely agree with you though, Matt. To take an analogy, 15 years or so ago, when I was kind of starting out as a trainee and then a newly qualified solicitor, we got a technologist, like an IT guy, into our tech and data protection legal team, because we knew that we can possibly understand in detail what it takes to code one of the products that we were having to advise on. And it was a really, really good thing. It made us more knowledgeable. It made the connection between us and our clients a bit cleaner. And also he was able to add value to our clients directly as well. And so drawing that analogy forwards, finding people who really understand, as you say, who are trained in understanding the big questions around ethics or comparative analysis of what's going on elsewhere, and building them into your business. Sure, there's a cost, but actually I think it's an investment that is returned at the back end. So yeah, fully in favour of that.
Yeah. I think I'll just finish off by saying, I think I agree with Gareth to a point. The only slight caveat I'd put in there is just guarding against what I would describe as an echo chamber. Because often what you tend to find is when businesses go out to consult or seek an external view, they're inherently wired to find a consultant or find guidance that will play back what they need to hear. And so really it's just making sure that to the extent that is possible, you have got a degree of objectivity and trying to get an at arm's length view, ideally somebody who has a slightly different take on things. And certainly working within law, often when you're dealing with an issue, the tendency is, let's get a consultant, and you tend to get a consultant who's from a peer firm or a peer setup, and often you don't get the real challenge, the real checking, the real pushing back that would come from slightly more alternative view.
So I think then with Emma having gone, I'll just jump in and as a sort of stand-in chair, and maybe we should wrap up by everybody answering one question, which is what should the audience take away with them on this topic? To remember and to be thinking about maybe over the weekend. What should they be taking away? What should they be percolating?
I think for me, I'd say ownership. It's really being a bit more proactive and being more engaged with who has your data, what are they doing with it? And to speak to Garrett's world, is it consistent with the permission that you have given for that data to be used for? I think that is important. And in a world where we engage an awful lot with technology, we've become almost a bit automatic in giving permission, giving consent, accept, so you can get to the transaction or get to where you need to be. And it's us really just stopping and saying, do I need to have my email, date of birth, my home address and postcode signed up every single time? And, when you're in a supermarket or shops, do I need to have a receipt for a $9.99 item emailed to me? Perhaps not. And it's really starting to ask those types of questions.
I can see that Matt's now being chucked off the platform as well. So Gareth.
the final word. For me, I think it's, I better make it good, don't I? For me, I think we touched upon this a little earlier, but if you're a business, particularly if you're a startup business or a fast growth business and you're trying to build customer base, build revenue, build your profit, clearly there's an imperative there, which is something other than thinking about data ethics. I think my closing view would be data ethics doesn't have to come at the cost of profitability or the commercial considerations that you have as a business. There is a way to think ethically and still have a hard-nosed commercial approach if that's what you're looking for.
Definitely. And I see Matt's back, so we can have one quick final closing word from Matt as well. What should the audience be taking away with them?
I'm in no way skilled or equipped to answer that question. I would always be a big one to say, just look at policy, find a really good outlet that gives a nice policy summary, and just keep an eye on what's happening in other countries to see if there's any models or ideas or things about that could be used for your application. And I'd also advocate everybody to speak to their local MP and engage with them about how this stuff impacts upon them, or how does it work, and would be my big pitch, I think.
Great. Well, with my Emma hat on, maybe I will make the moment now to finish off. So yeah, thank you everybody. I'm sure Emma would be really pleased as well to see how we've managed to carry on after these technical issues. So yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you very much.